Thank you, Dean De Dios, for your very generous introduction. Distinguished guests, education reform advocates, colleagues, and friends. For over a century, our nation has gone through many seasons of education reform. Each season sowing seeds of hope, with sprouts of initiative coming to life, but with growth confined to small and separate plots. In many parts of the field, growth may have even been stunted or aborted. Why reforms don't take root, spread throughout the education field, build up from one season to the next, and transform the sector and Philippine society is the subject of our narrative this afternoon. I will walk you through the reform seasons in broad sweep, mentioning some of the seeds of hope planted and highlighting those that bloom. I will explore institutional reasons why reforms are not sustained or scaled up, arguing strongly for the decentralization of education and the active involvement of various human agencies, networks, and organizations on the ground. Alan will move on to narrate the constraints posed by ways of thinking that frame education practices. Observing that learning remains at the margins of reform efforts, he will argue that it ought to take center stage. In terms of learning goals, Alan will stress the need for expanded forms of functional literacy and the development of transformational citizenship. More specifically, he will highlight the importance of building every Filipino's competence to learn how to learn throughout life in a fast-changing global environment while remaining deeply rooted in the Filipino nation. On the premise that functional literacy, learning how to learn, and critical thinking must be developed as basic competencies of Filipino children in this century, Dina will discuss how entwined the language policy and building these competencies are. Language has been a major constraint to the development of thinking skills that our people need to solve our nation's 19th and 20th century problems and to participate in the knowledge-based world of the 21st century. It is, therefore, an issue that we must resolve once and for all. The three of us will conclude with broad strokes recommendations for cultivating a more fertile soil so that education reforms can take root, build up from one season to the next, and help transform the education sector and our society. Let me now give you an overview of the reform seasons. The Philippines has had a long history of education reform. Although our education system evolved from a colonial cocoon, the American imperialist agenda nevertheless included a reformist seed. It made elementary education compulsory to enable mass participation in elections and thereby break the hold of the oligarchy. By so doing, it hoped to undermine the elitist educational system under Spain that left the Filipino masses unschooled. However, transplanting an American education model into an oligarchic system that the Americans reinforced by co-opting the elite did not result in egalitarian structures. Neither did it level the playing field in education. The education system in the early American colonial period supported prevailing inequities. Primary education was for the working class, secondary education for the middle class, and tertiary education for leaders and the economic elite who demanded the establishment of an American system of higher education. The creation of the University of the Philippines in 1908 satisfied this demand and capped the development of a three-tiered public education system which has morphed into our system today. Despite its class-biased and colonial orientation, the reformist seed planted in the early days of colonial education sprouted somewhat. It provided a means of social mobility for significant numbers of poor Filipinos. It also produced critical and nationalist thinkers who pushed for social reforms in different periods of the 20th century. The establishment of the public education system heralded a series of reform-oriented initiatives with progressive assumptions. Consider the 1925 Monroe Survey. Yale professor George Counts, was part of this team. In October 1925, his assessment of the key problems of Philippine education sounded like the issues confronting our country today. Half of the children were outside the reach of schools. Pupil performance was generally low in subjects that relied on English, although achievement in math and science was at par with the average performance of American school children. Counts attributed these problems in 1925 to the language of teaching in a culturally diverse colony. In fact, Counts bewailed the teaching of subjects in English in the absence of a lingua franca. He argued that this sacrificed efficiency of instruction in the native tongue. Counts also argued that the curriculum was not suited to the Filipino children in the 1920s. They were handicapped by their reliance on experiences drawn from a civilization alien to them. Not only were they acquiring new ideas in a language not their own, they were also studying under a curriculum borrowed from the United States, using materials suited for American children. Their teachers were also professionally untrained. But the Monroe Survey's severest criticism of the Philippine education system in 1925 was on its excessive centralized control, which resulted in the uniform implementation of a Western curriculum throughout the archipelago. For Counts, this one-size-fits-all practice was utterly indefensible, considering the great diversity of climate, occupation, and cultural traditions in the Philippines. UP history professor Digna Apilado wrote that our public education had not always been centralized. The American colonial government initially required municipalities and provinces to finance primary and secondary schools respectively, setting aside state funds only for the state university. Local primary schools briefly enjoyed a wide range of autonomy to design their curriculum and educational materials. However, they lost this freedom to innovate and respond to local needs because towns and provinces were too poor to defray the costs of free and compulsory schooling. The insular government was thus compelled to assume funding for all three education levels. Since 1925, various reviews have cited the same fundamental issues afflicting Philippine education. This prompted four leading educationists to facetiously say that the education landscape has not changed since colonial days. We will not repeat the usual lamentations about persistent inequities and poor pupil performance. We will, however, cite two less known but nevertheless disturbing observations. The Basic Education Assistance for Mindanao, or BEAMS, region-wide assessment in mathematics, science, and English revealed that sampled students in 3 Mindanao regions, including ARM, had great difficulty with test items requiring higher-order thinking skills. In particular, high school students in the sample were unable to apply concepts and reasoning to real-life situations. Equally distressing are comparisons of the country's primary net enrollment and completion rates with those of other countries in Asia-Pacific. The 2008 World Bank education data show that Cambodia and Laos have higher primary net enrollment and completion rates than us. The contrast with our neighbors Indonesia and Malaysia, with whom we wanted to establish a Malay sub-region in the ASEAN region, is sharp. The two countries have primary enrollment and completion rates that are really much higher than ours. Although the same issues have persisted since the 1960s, a review of the last 40 years revealed significant changes within and outside education institutions. The 1970 Presidential Commission to Survey Philippine Education, for instance, reorganized the educational system to address over-centralization and the mismatch between educational output and the country's needs. Outside the education bureaucracy, the late UP professor Maludo Ranilla claimed that the NGOs and POs of the mass movement in the same period sought to address the irrelevance of education with counter-education, literacy, and other community-based political education efforts. Spanning the education spectrum, these initiatives included neighborhood daycare centers, alternative schools for special children, and also farmer scientist programs. Some of the education practices of these groups were eventually mainstreamed. The groups would also participate in extensive networks of educators in and out of government. 4 broad education reform frameworks emerged in the last 20 years alone, jointly led by Senator Angara and Congressman Padilla and implemented by a technical secretariat headed by former UP Visayas Chancellor Junicia Rolla, who is here today. The Congressional Commission on Education, or EDCOM, proposed a comprehensive set of reforms. on issues ranging from access and quality to language of instruction. It restructured the education system into DepEd, CHED, and TESDA. Subsequent plans drew from this analysis, frameworks, and recommendations. The Basic Education Sector Reform Agenda, or the BESRA, DepEd's latest reform framework, is comprehensive and offers enough spaces for NGOs and private sector networks outside the basic education bureaucracy to carve their respective niches in. In addition to these frameworks, the country has two landmark policy covers affecting basic education: the transfer, at least in theory, of the governance of basic education to schools through the 2001 Governance of Basic Education Act and the promulgation in 2006 of the National Competency-Based Teacher Standards, which aims to develop higher-order thinking skills and learning competencies. The last 40 years also saw at least one major DepEd-related reform project every 3 years on the average. This number excludes smaller DepEd projects, and I never realized the achievements of DepEd until we looked at these smaller projects, as well as the projects undertaken by the more than 60 NGO and private sector groups